All right, go ahead.
Okay. Good morning, Gahanna. I'll read question number 2. Political and social movements in American history have been successful because of the right of assembly. President Abraham Lincoln wrote in a letter that, quote, the right of peaceful assembly, unquote, is part of the, quote, constitutional substitute for revolution, end quote. Do you agree or disagree with President Lincoln? Why? What is the history of freedom of assembly in America? And what historical or contemporary evidence is there, if any, that political and social movements have led to significant changes in law or policies? And what limits, if any, should be placed on the right to freedom of assembly? You may begin.
The freedom of assembly has been a substantial part of our growth as a nation. From the women's suffrage movements of the 20th century to the Black Lives Matter protests in 2020, practicing this freedom can bring out the best in our country. President Lincoln was correct in writing that peaceable assembly is part of the constitutional substitute for revolution, because with this freedom, instead of voicing opinions through violence, the people can voice their opinions peacefully and lawfully. When the assembly is peaceful, it allows ideas to be heard and can educate communities on issues they may not have known of. However, when assembly becomes violent, it no longer serves its intended purpose.
Freedom of assembly has not been an absolute right throughout history. In 1833, Barron v. Baltimore had ruled that the protections of the First Amendment did not apply to state and local governments. This later prompted the start of syndicalism laws in the states. For a century, the Supreme Court followed these rulings. However, in the defense opinion of Whitney v. California, Justice Brandeis wrote that the free exchange of ideas is the only way to prevent the dissemination of harmful beliefs and to create a resolution for supposed injustices. In other words, meaning that the First Amendment should protect the rights of those in the states so it can be their form of constitutional revolution instead of violence stemming from the restriction of their freedom of assembly. In later years, Brandenburg v. Ohio overturned the decision of Whitney v. California, ruling the syndicalism laws unconstitutional. Freedom of assembly has developed under the First Amendment to apply to those in the states and has in turn become our substitute for revolution.
Social movements have severely impacted laws and policies throughout American history, both negatively and positively. The fight for women's suffrage is an example of how freedom of assembly can move our country forward with no violence necessary. In early 1917, protesters known as the Silent Sentinels became the first group to protest in front of the White House. Doing so was not easy, as many of the protesters were arrested in their acts. Nevertheless, their peaceful fight paid off when Tennessee became the 36th state to ratify the 19th Amendment, thus granting women's suffrage. 41 years later, the Bates versus Little Rock case in 1960 would make a statement for the civil rights movement. Many social justice activities were organized by the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Cities tried to limit the NCAAP's activities by imposing an occupational tax ordinance, which required local branches to turn over their membership lists by checking tax status. After refusing to turn over names, Daisy Bates and Bertie Williams were found guilty in a trial court. They took the case to Supreme Court and their convictions were reversed. This ruling was a big step in giving African Americans civil rights, especially concerning the freedom of assembly.
Limits should be placed on our right to freedom of assembly to prohibit unlawful assembly or when an illegal practice is happening without good intent or breaching the peace of the public. On January 6th of this year, many protesters assembled at the Capitol building in support of President Trump. These protesters had the right to assemble outside of the building. However, the moment they broke through the barriers on the steps of the Capitol, they were posing a threat to our national security. Furthermore, some of these protesters had weapons such as guns or bombs, turning this demonstration into a riot, an unconstitutional act. Additionally, the Supreme Court decides whether the people have a valid reason to assemble and determines if the assembly is constitutional. In Edwards versus South Carolina, 187 African American children were convicted because they were demonstrating against racial segregation. When taken to court, the Supreme Court ruled that the conviction of these children infringed on their constitutionally protected rights of free speech, free assembly, and freedom to petition for the redress of their grievances. Freedom of assembly is the right of the people. As Akhil says, it allows we the people to assemble and exercise our sovereign right to alter or abolish our government. Thank you.
Unmute,
That's it.
Candace.
Sorry. I was interested last night to see on the news that Pittsburgh, I think, has issued new rules about how the police can treat protesters, peaceful protesters, and they're apparently not allowed, the new law that says they're not allowed to use tear gas or rubber bullets or assault anybody in any fashion. What do you think of that? Do you think we need to have that across the country? Do you think that might be part of a federal response to the protests that have gone on this summer?
I do believe that this could be a law that spreads across the country and would be a good thing, because when people are protesting peacefully, there is no reason to return that with violence. They're not doing anything to harm you. So when the police return that movement with violence, it doesn't help anyone and just makes people angry.
Yeah, I agree with my teammate. And I think the response that the government made with the new rules to handling protests, I think this is more proof that President Lincoln was right in the question that we were given, that the freedom of assembly is part of the constitutional substitute for revolution, because we're changing our country and we're changing the way that people can have their voices heard. And by these restrictions on the police allowing people to assembly, I think that it's really good for the growth of our nation, as we said in our presentation.
Great, thank you. Rebecca?
In DeYoung versus Oregon, the Supreme Court held that freedom of assembly was as important as freedom of speech. Do you agree or disagree? And explain your answer.
I do agree with that, because freedom of assembly is a right where people are able to gather together, and it helps them kind of reiterate whatever they are trying to show off to the government. And just as freedom of speech is speaks directly to the government, freedom of assembly shares how the people can come together and share their view of the government.
But isn't just speech enough? Why would assembly be as important? If I could just tell the government what's going on and my friends can tell the government, why is assembly so important?
When you assemble, your voice is a lot stronger, because if one person is trying to spread a whole message across the entire nation, that would be much harder to do than if you were able to gather together and everyone use their voice simultaneously, and that makes your voice a lot stronger, obviously. And I feel like you can't really have freedom of speech and freedom of assembly just go together, because when you assemble, most of the time it's because you all want to make your freedom of speech stronger in general.
Lindsay?
If the protests, marches, sit-ins bring about violent responses from counter-protesters, can that violence be a basis for a city or a government or a police department saying, it's too dangerous to have these protests, you need to stop it? It's not the protesters who've acted out, it's people who don't want them there. But can the threat of that violence be enough to stop it?
No, I don't believe that the threat of that violence can be enough, because the people have the right to be there. So if they're getting pushback from violence, there should be regulations to stop those people who are being violent towards them instead.
To go off of what my teammate said, I kind of, for that kind of situation, I would use the logic of you could go in your car and know that there's a risk of wherever you're going that you might, but you can't say that it's too dangerous to drive because there's a chance of crashing. Like people if people are motivated to assemble, they know the risks that they're taking. And if they're met with violence and they're truly a peaceful cause and peaceful protest, then the aggressors should be the one punished and not the people who are trying to make a difference.
Okay, thank you.
Very nice. Could you tell me a bit more about the Bates versus Little Rock? Sorry.
Yeah. So I thought this had to do with how freedom of assembly has evolved throughout, and how we specifically African American community has been able to have their freedom of assembly more accepted in this country. Because obviously 1960 was a time of segregation and lots of discrimination towards African Americans. And I just feel like this was important to include because it was a massive step, I feel like, for making things more equal, giving African Americans more of an equal chance, because this was one of the first times where like the African American was even able to use their rights in trial by jury to full advantage and actually take a case far to the point where they would be found not guilty and justice would be served for African Americans. So I feel like it was just a massive step, and that's why I included it.
Thank you.
In looking at the court cases historically, there have been some limits placed on assembly. What are they, and are they justified in your mind? If any.
What did you say? I couldn't quite hear you.
All right. I said there have been a number of court cases that have placed limits on assembly. Are those limits, if any, justified?
Yes, those limits would be justified. For example, in the court case Adderley versus Florida, wherein high schoolers were protesting for civil rights on a prison grounds, that was justified because it was deemed inappropriate, an inappropriate setting for high schoolers to share their to assemble.
Also, and another limit that has been placed is in the Supreme Court case in Ohio, Coates versus City of Cincinnati. There were a group of people assembled and they were convicted of annoying conduct, and that violated their freedom of assembly rights because you cannot arrest someone simply for talking to people or annoying them on the street.
What a great job. That was a great job. So nice to hear so many good examples, and Baltimore and Silent Sentinels and Edwards versus Supreme Court. That was really a lovely job. I just want to throw out that I have two conflict in my background, I suppose. My great-great-grandmother was a fierce anti-suffragist, and her grandson, though, started the legal office for the NAACP, formed the first legal office for the NAACP. So I guess I have the whole range of yes and no's.
This might just be me, but I can't hear anything.
Oh, I'm sorry. It might be you. But can you hear me now? Isaiah, can you hear me? Can you hear us now?
Isaiah, you're muted if you're speaking.
Well, perhaps.
I can't
hear anything right now. Like I can see y'all moving, but I can't hear anybody talking.
Okay. Well, maybe Benazia, you could tell them that they've done a wonderful job, and maybe they can take a look. You can take a look, Isaiah, at the recording later to hear what we said, because you did a great job. Rebecca?
Sure. I do think you did a great job, and starting off first off the bat for us, excellent job. I appreciated your prepared remarks and the history that you went through. I particularly appreciated our discussion in the question and answer where you were able to remember some court cases that were not in your prepared remarks
Right.
and apply them in answering our questions and giving us a little detail about each one so we knew which one you were talking about in case we didn't recall the names of the cases. I liked that you have thought through what happens when you go to a protest where you know there's a potential for violence to occur, and that you landed on basically you assume the risk. So if you're going, you're assuming the risk. I thought that was an interesting concept for you to understand and impart on us. So I thought you did a really good job, and I appreciated your presentation today.
I also need to compliment you on, first off, the statement, secondly, being able to answer our questions. Really worry that we may not know the depth of your knowledge because we just happened to ask a question that gave you the chance. You know, you made the Adderley and Coates references right there at the end. If the right question hadn't come along, that might not have come up. And I'm glad you had some stuff back in reserve to give us, but somehow find a way to get it out there, because I wouldn't want, you know, stuff that's on, you know, that's in your back pocket doesn't do any good once we're done. So I just need to tell you that I'm glad it came out. Really worried that it might not have. Last thing I want to tell you, and this isn't a criticism, this is just an observation about something. There have been protests that have come in your lifetime, in your school time. You know, I can't think of anything that was more impressive than those young people from Marjorie Stoneman Douglas School. And that was since you've been in school, where some young people said, hey, grown people, you all have had this whole thing with guns for half a decade or decade and a half or something, and you haven't done anything. We're going to take it on now. So just kind of bear in mind, some of it is contemporary. Yes, talk about the civil rights movement. Yes, talk about women's suffrage movement, but there's some stuff happening now in your lifetime. Okay, you did a great job. Thanks. Okay.